Hello, Doc. I'm about to report the basic concepts in assessment. So, allow me to present to you my PowerPoint presentation as to how I was able to come up with certain research on what assessment is all about as part of our lesson. So, first, I would like to introduce to you the rationale of the study. So, as teachers, we are continually facing with the challenge of assessing the progress of our students as well as our effectiveness as teachers. That's according to Guzman Santos of 2007. The progress of the student often equated with how effective a teacher is. So, as part of what we continually do to our students, no, assessment is very important in order for us to make sure that our students are well observed, and at the same time we totally know the progress in terms of education or based on the pathway that they're going. No, so why do you decide for an assessment? So first, assessment's decision could substantially improve students' performance. It guides the teachers in enhancing the teaching learning process, and it assists policymakers in improving the educational system. So with this, it comes to a point that we have to make sure na as teachers we will be able to provide proper guidance for our students in order for them to show their performance based on what they're showing and based on what we are also teaching. It's also very important that there would be process, no, in providing teaching to our students, and it should always be starting with assessment as the primary a way of doing such. And of course, policymakers will be able to have an idea of how they could be able to enrich the minds of the students in terms of how they were being assessed by their teachers, because in this point it's actually the stepping stone of the milestone of the students, no? So poor assessment procedures could adversely affect the students, teacher, and administrators, in which that is correct, because if you will be able to have a poor assessment to your students, that would lead to somehow a poor performance with regards to what they are showing in school. Another rationale is assessment of learning is tricky business. Why? Because it's indeed for it requires measuring concepts, ideas, and abstract constructs, quite unlike the assessment of physical quantities, which can be done with appropriate degree of accuracy. So that means to say that if we will not be able to establish a very good way of assessing our students, that's a very difficult for us to help these students grow in terms of acquiring knowledge, skills, and attitude. It's because we were not able to assess them in the very beginning of their learning. In assessment of learning, we deal with intangible and attempt to characterize them in a manner that would be widely understood. So it's one way for us to determine, no, if our students will be able to know what we are doing, and at the same time, we will be able to come up into what particular things that we have to supplement to our students in terms of what they need to learn as well. So for the introduction, as educators, we have to have a thorough grasp of the why, what, and how of assessing students' learning. We also have the underlying philosophy of that assessment of learning rather than assessment of learning per se. We also have assessment for learning. Students are assessed in order to enhance the teaching and learning process guided by the principle that education is a lifelong activity and does not cease after one's graduation from school. An assessment of learning is certainly the building block by which we introduce the ideas of assessment from learning in Philippine school. And assessment as learning can be used in conjunction to support student achievement and is used as a purpose of greater learning achievement, is a process of developing and supporting students' active participation, and is used for purposes for providing evidences of achieving for reporting. So this is what we're gonna know as to how the important skills as well as with the knowledge of how can we assess students. So part of the introduction that I was able to introduce is certainly trying to identify our gaps and our problems in which students are able to learn in such a way that they are properly and being assessed well. So definitions, no. So according to Lin and Miller of 2005, they defined it as an assessment of variety of procedures used to obtain information about student performance. An assessment refers to full range of information gathered and synthesized by teachers about their students and their classroom. That's according to Ahrens of 1994. And assessment is a method for analyzing and evaluating student achievement or program success. So these are definitions of assessment in which it's scholarly based, and at the same time, lots of definitions were being involved or being given as to what assessment is all about. However, these three assessments are for me are the most important things that we could somehow um, somehow bridge into what assessment is. So, assessment for learning. So, it's practice for students are encouraged to be more active in their learning and associated assessment. The ultimate purpose of assessment for learning is to create self-regulated learners who can leave school able and confident to continue learning throughout their lives. And at the same time, teacher needs to know at the outset of a unity of study where their students are in terms of learning and then continually check on how are progressing through strengthening the feedback they get from their learners. So that is actually correct that as teachers, we have the role, we play a very important role into the assessment of our students. It's because it should start from the teacher and it should give a feedback to the student as to what the progress of the student learning is. And it's very important that we really have to guide these students as to what they're doing, as to things that they're learning, and skills that they are enhancing. Measurement, evaluation, and assessment. So, measurement, as used in education, refers to the process of quantifying an individual's achievement, personality, and attitudes, among others, by means of appropriate measuring instruments. On the other way, educational measurement, this is actually the first step towards elevating a field of study into a science, is to take measurement of the quantities and qualities of interest in field. And evaluation is being defined as the process of systematic collection and analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data of the purpose of making some decisions and judgment. So thus, measurement and assessment are essential in evaluation. So this is actually a very good formula in which we will be able to come up with a good evaluation if we will be able to measure as well as we'll be able to assess our students' learning, and part of which is our roles and responsibilities as teachers. So the purpose of educational assessment, measurement, and evaluation. So I identified 6 different implications and purposes of these 3 matters. So first, it improves the student learning. It improves the student learning. It's because we are making it sure that our students are in right progress. Identification of students' strengths and weaknesses. It's very important that as early as that particular stage, students will be able to identify their strengths and weaknesses in order for them to know if they are doing well or if there are things that they have to enhance. Assessment of effectiveness of a particular teaching strategy. So as teachers, we have to make sure that there are lots of strategies that we could apply. And now, through technology, we will be able to have lots of strategies in teaching as to how we will be able to assess properly and evaluate them for effectivity. Appraisal of effectiveness of the curriculum. Curriculums are very important tools that we will be able to utilize as teachers, because it's one way for us to coordinate each other, not just us, but as well as with our students, their parents, their guardians, co-teachers, and the rest of the faculty as well as in the educational team in order for us to come up with a very good curriculum that we could provide to our students. Next is the assessment and improvement of teaching effectiveness. So it's very important that from time to time, our way of teaching is getting effective and effective or more competitive in such a way that this could guide to our students, no, communication with and involvement of parents in their child's learning. So this would be a collaborative process that learning should not always be in school, but it should also be in the family. It's very important that there is a support from their family as to how they'll be able to learn, because in that way we'll be able to know and contrast their learning in school as well as their learning in their respective homes. So basic concepts in assessment, no? As teachers, we are continually faced with the challenge of assessing the progress of our students as well as our effectiveness as teachers. So it's not only that we have to assess our students, but we also have to have self-assessment of our own. It's because teaching comes from us, and whatever things that we're teaching to our students, they'll be able to learn from you. And what they'll be able to learn from you, they'll be able to apply it. Educational measurement, no? The first step towards elevating as a field of study into a science is to take measurements of the quantities and qualities of interest of work. So there are two different types of measurements. So these are your objective and subjective measurements. So if we're going to talk about objective measurements, these are measurements that do not depend on person or individual taking the measurement. However, on the other hand, subjective measurement often differ from one assessor to the next, even if the same quantity or quality is being measured. Okay? So this is actually being noticed to the student itself. But objectives, what you're able to assess or observe to your student. Assessment, test, and measurement. So test, this is actually an instrument or systematic procedure for measuring a sample of behavior by posing a set of questions in a uniform manner. So we all know that test is very important because we have to recheck the knowledge of our students if they're able to learn from that. And that's a very good tool in order for us to determine or trying to assess if they're able to learn based on your discussion or the way that you taught them. Measurement, it's the process of obtaining a numerical description of a degree to which an individual possesses a particular characteristic. So measurement answers the question how much. So it's more into how we quantify the learning of our students. So test, non-test, examination, test item, and quizzes. So first, again, a test is an educational setting is a question or a series of questions in which we aim to determine how well a student learned from subject or topic taught. Another definition that we have to come up is a non-test. It's actually a question or activity which determines the interest, attitude, and other students' characteristic whose answers are not judged wrong or correct. So say for example, personality inventory. What is your favorite sport? Why do you prefer green vegetables? So it's actually the whys, no? So they have to expound their answers. A test basically is more into objective type. So in examination, it's a long test which may or may be composed of one or more test formats. Say for example, our midterm examination, licensure examination for teachers or any professional tracks, as well as comprehensive exams. And test items is a question included a test or examinations for, say for example, who is the president of the Philippines, no? When was the World War II broke out? Is Little Red Riding Hood a short story? So these are actually into objective type as well. And a quiz. It's actually a short test, usually given at the beginning, or at the end of the discussion period, just to evaluate if our students were able to learn such. So various roles of assessment. So assessment plays a number of roles in making instructional decision. Why? Because in that way, we will be able to know which particular instructions that we have to revise, the things that we have to implement, and the things that we are going to improve. Okay, so first we have one role, a summative role. So an assessment may be done for summative purposes, as in the illustration given above for grade 6 mathematics achievement. So that's a very good example of a summative role. Diagnostic role assessment may be done for diagnostic purposes rather. In that case, we are interested in determining the gaps in learning or learning process and hopefully to be able to bridge these gaps. We also have formative assessment. It's another purpose of assessment, informative. In this role, assessment guides the teacher on his or her day-to-day teaching activity. Placement, we define this as the final role of assessment in curricular decision concerns placement. Assessment plays a vital role in determining the appropriate placement of a student, both in terms of achievement and aptitude. And aptitude is being defined as it refers to the area or a discipline where a student would most likely excel or even do well. So with these terms, various roles of assessment is being emphasized as well as it's being taken consideration as to how we'll be able to make sure that we teachers have roles in making sure instructional decisions are being made. So a system model for evaluation. So we have here a diagram. Okay, it's composed of 5 different little boxes and there is an arrow going into. Now first that it should start with the context, next with the input, the process, the output, and the outcome. So if we are going to dig in deeper with the diagram, it's more into how you plan. So context is more into how you plan it first, making it sure that you proceed of what inputs that you're going to incorporate in terms of your teaching. You have to deliver it through a particular process, and whatever is the outcome would be your output for that based on the diagram that is being illustrated. Thus, evaluation provides a tool for determining the extent to which an educational process or program is effective and all the same time indicates direction for remediating process of the curriculum that do not contribute to successful student performance. So that's actually with Jason of 2003. Evaluation is a process of gathering and interpreting evidences regarding the problem and progress of individuals in achieving desirable educational goals. So evaluation would always comes with assessment. There will be no evaluation that will be done if you will not be able to undergo with assessment. So these two would always come together. So one of the chief purpose of evaluation is the improvement of the individual learner. So the reason why that we have to evaluate is to make sure if our learner is being assessed, if they are being able to improve or not. Because if not, we have to go back to basics as to which particular loophole are we into, or what particular things or even gaps or even problems that we have to consider as to why our student wasn't able to improve. Another purpose of evaluation would include to maintain standards, to select students, to motivate learners and their learning, to guide learning, to furnish instruction, and to appraise educational instrumentalities. So these purposes serves as a guide for us teachers in order for us to make sure that our students are on the right track. We will be able to determine which particular part of learning of our students is being taken for granted or things that we have to look back. No, it's because through evaluation we will be able to know if our students were able to learn from you, or you yourself have deficiency as to what you are doing now, in which from for the students perspective they are not actually helpful for them. So evaluation, function of evaluation, we have prediction, diagnosis, and even research. So areas of educational evaluation that includes the achievement, the aptitude, the interest, the personality. A well-defined system of evaluation, it enables one to clarify goals, check upon each phase of development, diagnose learning difficulties, plan carefully for remediation. So these particular information would always help us with our way, no, of making sure that our students are not taken for granted. Just say, for example, with the functions of evaluation, it's one way for us to know if we are doing it right. We are there to know if our students will be able to go into the right track, or these students were able to learn based on our assessment as well as with the things that we have evaluated during the last part. And it could be done into research as to what particular gaps were being identified and even problems for us to come up with a better plan. And talking about areas of educational evaluation, it's more into how do we make sure that our students are interested of what we have taught to them, making it sure that these students will be able to achieve things that they were able to accomplish, not just for themselves, as well as for their application, for them to apply it in their certain lives, and making it sure that their personality is being enhanced as well. And if we're going to incorporate evaluation as the well-defined system, we're making it sure that development of the students are being noted, and making it sure that their goals are being clarified as well. And if there are any things that we have to consider, we have to provide remedy to it, as well as the things that we have for the things that we have to diagnose in terms of learning difficulties. So, principles of educational evaluation. Evaluation must be based on previously accepted educational objectives. So, that means to say that we have to be objective into the things that we are doing as teachers, and evaluation should be a continuous and comprehensive and cumulative process, because it's not just there, no. So if you're going to talk about evaluation, it's a process, it's a systematic process that it comes with different steps, because before you'll be able to evaluate the student, you have to make sure that there are things that you're going to present first. Also, evaluation should recognize that total individual personality is involved in learning. So we have to make sure that the objectives that we are making would fit or tailor fit to the student's involvement of learning. And evaluation should be democratic and cooperative. That means to say that it is not just your own decision that will be taken. However, you have to consider things or ideas coming from different perspectives. Evaluation should be positive and action directed. So that means to say that through evaluation, there are things and actions that we have to take from time to time. We don't need to rush it. We have to make sure that every step is being analyzed and things should be properly well cascaded. Evaluation should give opportunity to the pupil or student to become increasingly independent in self-appraisal and self-direction. So this, we have to make sure that our students are going to the right path and the right direction based on the objectives as well as with our goals in terms of teaching. Evaluation should include all significant evidences for every possible sources. So we have to make sure that it should be scholarly based, making it sure that it should be evidence based applications and even practice, because we have to incorporate research as to how to improve the the quality of evaluation. And lastly, evaluation should take into consideration the limitations of particular educational situations. So we have to consider certain situations which is going on right now. So if we're going to look at a very good example, that would be this pandemic, in which we have lots of innovation and things that we are manipulating just to make sure that learners will be able to learn what we're teaching, as well as we are supplementing them through technology. Measurement, test, and evaluation. So defining measurement, it's a part of educational evaluation process whereby some tool or instruments are used to provide quantitative description of the progress of students towards desirable educational goals. And talking about testing, it's a systematic procedure to determine the presence or absence of certain characteristic of qualities for our learners. And we also have different types of evaluation. So let's take it one by one. That's the placement, formative, diagnostic, and even the summative. So, educational assessment serves three different functions according to Bernardo of 2003. So, student selection and certification. So, to make decision about which students get admitted, retained, promoted, and certified for graduation. So, that means to say that before we're going to certify a student or having a or placing her as a candidate for her to be certified or him to be certified, we have to make sure that we're able to evaluate that student through the things that we have to consider in our educational assessment. Next is instructional monitoring. This provides information about student learning and teaching performance to help teachers monitor, manage, and make decisions about the instructional system. So it's very important that instructional monitoring is being applied because everything should be anchored of what is been given by DepEd. And if we're going to look at the local context here in the Philippine setting, we have to make sure that our curriculum as well as the way of teaching should be anchored as to how the the vision as well as the mission of DepEd should be aligned. And last is public accountability and program evaluation, making decisions about different aspects of educational process. And of course, we have to make sure that there would be a good decision if they will be able to provide accurate, authentic, reliable, and valid information about educational learning goals. So those are actually part of the educational assessment according to Bernardo. So principles of educational assessment. So we have lots of principles actually, and to cite the first principle is that educational assessment always begins with educational values and standards. Second is assessment is not an end in itself, but a vehicle of attaining educational goals and for improving on these educational goals. Third, these educational goals and values and standards should be made explicit to all concerned from the very beginning. Fourth, desired learning competencies such as your skills, knowledge, values, ways of thinking, and even learning determine what we choose to assess. Educational values and standards should always be characterized as to how we assess, and assessment systems should lead educators to help students attain the educational goals, values, and standards. So, if you're going to summarize and giving synthesis of this first six principles of educational assessment, it's very important that we have certain values to follow as we go back to our BGMO, which part of which are our values that we have to have, we always make sure that the principles of educational assessment is in line with that. And it's very important that we have to go back to the roots and teach that one to our students in order for them to be able to obtain learning. So we also have characteristics of learning. So assessment is not a single event but a continuous cycle. So that means to say that assessment would not always stop from there. Through its process, as we've identified in the previous slides, that it will not just stop from the first process, but it continuously go like a cycle. Assessment must be open process, so that means to say that it should be open. It should be open in terms of criticisms as well as things that need to be improved, things that are right and being identified correctly. Assessment must promote valid inferences, so things should be anchored through research. There should be inferences as well as references to whatever things that we are doing. Assessment that matters should always employ multiple measures of performance. So this is one way for us to make sure that the performance of our students are being checked. Assessment should measure what is worth learning, not just what is easy to measure. So that means to say that things should be properly being done, things should be properly being measured, and making it sure that learning for students is worth giving. Assessment should support every student's opportunity to learn important mathematics. So this is actually a very good way for us to see a very good example through mathematics. Now, we have to really support our students' opportunity to learn, and we should not degrade them or give them things that aren't supportive to them. So elements of assessment process. So first, assessment should center on the learner and the learning process. That's actually from Huba and Fried of 2000. Explain the four elements of learner-centered assessment. So first is formulating statements of intended learning outcome. Second is developing or selecting assesstive measures. Third, creating experiences leading to outcome. And last, discussing and using assessment results to improve learning. So with these elements of assessment process, these process should be done and should be obtained by students. Not one of these elements should be taken for granted because this is part of the process, and if one process has not been able to be attained by the educator as well as with the learner, tendency is this won't be achievable. So the three types of learning, believing that there were more than one type of learning, that's with Benjamin Bloom and the Committee of Colleague in 1956, that they identified domains of educational activities. So the cognitive, referring to the mental, the affective, into growth, feeling or even emotion, and psychomotor, which is referring to manual or even physical skills. So these particular types of learning were being tackled with our discussion in our previous meeting. So I just don't have to emphasize it one by one. So the three types of learning, um, cognitive knowledge, according to Bloom of 1956, this involves knowledge and development of intellectual skills. This includes the recall or recognition of specific facts, procedural patterns, and concept that serves development of intellectual abilities and even skills. Next is psychomotor, which is the second domain. That's more into early 70s. That's with Simpson, Dave, and Harrow, which recommended categories for the psychomotor domain, which include physical coordination and even movement, and the use of the different body parts of an individual. And lastly is the attitude or your affective domain, in which it refers into uh, which we deal with a certain situation, say for example emotionally, such as feelings, appreciation, and even enthusiasm, motivation. We have values and even attitude. And the taxonomy is ordered into five levels as the person progresses towards internalization, in which the attitude or feeling consistently guides or controls a person's behavior. Diagnostic assessment. So it identifies weakness, strengths, and even problem of students' learning. Diagnostic assessment also can be teacher bias or of planning what to do next in the teaching and learning process. So that's one way for us to diagnose our students, and we have to identify these certain factors and issues in order for us to be guided. Dynamic assessment, it's more into the measurement as to what the student achieves when given some teaching in an unfamiliar topic or certain field. And it's also can be useful to assess potential for specific learning in the absence of relevant prior attainment, or at assess general learning potential for students who have a particular disadvantaged background. It is also often used in advance of the main body of teaching. So, a dynamic assessment is part of the process of assessment in such a way that we have to consider that things are not stagnant or not stable. So, when you say dynamic, there are certain factors that we also have to consider in assessing our students. Synoptic assessment. So, a synoptic assessment encourages students to combine elements of their learning from different parts of a program and show their accumulated knowledge and understanding of a topic or subject area. A synoptic assessment is also normally enables students to show their ability to integrate, to apply their skills, knowledge, and even their understanding with breadths and depths in the subject. So that's criterion reference assessment also. And of course, each student's sub-achievement is being judged as well against specific criteria. In principle, no account is taken of how other students have been able to perform. And in practice, normative thinking can affect judgment or whether or not a specific criterion has been met. Reliability and validity should be assured through process such as moderation, trial making, and even collation of exemplars. So, to give a synthesis of what synoptic assessment is, it's more into things that you are combining in order for your students to learn, making things that the program is working, and making sure that students will be able to accumulate knowledge, skills, and even enhance their attitude in such a way that topic or subject areas are being taken. So, ipsative assessment. So, when you say ipsative assessment, it refers to the process of self assessment. It's more into evaluation should provide for self assessment, and it gives students an opportunity to evaluate their own learning. So, ipsative assessment is making sure that our students have the responsibility of knowing the process of their way of assessing themselves. It's one way for us to make sure that students are also independent in terms of assessing themselves, because they are the ones who know better than others who will be able to assess them. Evaluative assessment provides instructors with curricular feedback. So, say for example, the value of field trip or oral presentation technique. So, another type of assessment is educative assessment. So, integrated with learning activities themselves, educative assessment builds students and even teachers or faculty insights and understanding about their own learning and teaching. In short, it's more into assessment of a form of learning. So, enhancing learning by enhancing assessment. So, assessment is a central element in the overall quality of teaching and learning in higher education. Its well designed assessment sets clear expectation, establishes a reasonable workload, one that does not push students into rote reproductive approaches to studies, and provides opportunities for students to self monitor, rehearse, practice, and receive feedback. Assessment is also an integral component of coherent educational experience. So that's one way for us to make sure that students are enhanced by their learning, and at the same time, we also have to make sure that their assessment is also being enhanced. So these two would always come together. And three objectives are a higher education assessment. So first objective is assessment that guides and encourages effective approach to learning. Assessment that the validity and reliability measures expected learning outcome, in particular with higher order learning and characterize higher education, and assessment and grading that defines and protects academic standards. So 16 indicators of effective assessment in higher education, a checklist for quality and student assessments. So let's just run through with this. Number one is assessment is treated by staff and student as an integral and prominent component of the entire teaching and learning process rather than the final adjunct to it. Number two is the multiple roles of assessment are recognized. The powerful motivating effect of assessment requirements on student is understood, and assessment tasks are designed to foster valued study habits. Number three is there is a faculty or departmental policy that guides individuals' assessment practices. Subjective assessment is integrated into overall plan of course of assessment. Number four, there is a clear alignment between expected learning outcomes that is taught and learned of knowledge and skills being assessed, and there is close and coherent curriculum loop. Number five, assessment task assess the capacity to analyze and synthesize new information and concepts rather than simply recall information previously presented. Number six is the variety of assessment method is being employed so that the limitations of particular methods are minimized. Seventh is the assessment tasks are designed to assess relevant generic skills as well as subject-specific knowledge and skills. Number eight, there is a steady progression in the complexity and demands of assessment requirements in the later years of courses. Ninth, there is a provision of student choice in assessment tasks and weighing at certain times. 10th, student and staff workloads are considered in the schedule and design of assessment tasks. 11th, excessive assessment is avoided. Assessment tasks are designed to sample student learning. 12th, assessment tasks are weighed to balance and develop formative and judgmental, summative roles of assessment. Early low stakes, low weight assessment is used to provide student with feedback. 13th, grades are calculated and reported on the basis of clearly articulated learning outcomes and criteria for levels of achievement. 14th, students receive explanatory and diagnostic feedback as well as good grades. 15, assessment tasks are checked to ensure that there are no inherent biases that may lead to disadvantage particular student groups. And 16th is plagiarism is minimized through careful task design, explicit education, and appropriate monitoring of academic honesty. So, just to give a summary of the 16 indicators of effective assessment, it would be best if we have these checklists on our end. It's because it's one way for us to make sure that the quality of student assessment is being noted and it's not being taken for granted. And it's also very important that we are always been guided as educators that through these 16 indicators of effective assessment, it's being implemented as well as evaluated and being applied to the students. So I would like to talk the assessment cycle. So when you talk about the assessment cycle, it's a good assessment follows an intentional and reflective process of design, implementation, evaluation, and even revision. The assessment cycle relies on four simple but dynamic words to represent this process. So I'm kind of familiar with the assessment cycle because it's just the PDCA. So that's the Plan, Do, Check, Act. This is quite a generic type of assessment cycle that is being used in different industries as well as in different sectors. However, in education, if we are going to apply the PDCA, that comes with the right outcomes. You also have the teach and learn, which is in the do, evaluate student work, which is the check, and revise and reinforce, which is the act. So first, you have to make sure that things should be planned first before you will be able to implement it. And once you already have the plan, make sure that you have to do it. Doing is reteaching and even learning. And once it's done, you have to check, evaluate. You have to evaluate students' work, students' capability, students' knowledge, students' attitude, and even skills if it's being enhanced. And next is to do an act, which means to say that it's not just more into reinforcement, but we also have to make sure if there are things that should be revised, especially in making the curricula. So things that you have to bear in mind when using the assessment cycle. What do I want my students to learn? How do I teach effectively? Are my outcomes being met or not met? Are goals being met or not met? How do I use what I've learned? So, negative experience relative to testing and assessment. So, I just would like to share one of a negative experience in my personal experiences based on testing and assessment. So, this was during my master's degree, which I experienced way back years ago. A negative testing and assessment experience would be when I was given a feedback from my assignment without having known the criteria in advance. So the feedback points which came as surprise that I hadn't even been given with a clear things about the requirements. So for me, it felt unfair. I felt unfair and illogical as my other experiences has been to be transparent, and I was not able to self-assess before the final outcome, which was judged, and therefore there was an essential learning step that was being missed by me as well as the instructor. And this was pretty typical of all secondary school experiences as well as postgraduate studies. So at that time, I did not question as if it was usually did okay, but I was never sure of the specific rationale. So even more confusing when it was a percentage rather than a grade. So as we took as a grade, B as is good, C as basic, pass, and etc., it all worked out by our brains of the course. So as a side note, this also greatly contributed to a good culture in such a way that students were able to consider themselves, no, to have good or not so good in the postgraduate studies. So Apart from the negative experience, I would like to share as well the positive experience relative to testing and assessment. So, in all honesty, the most positive experience came from receiving the highest grade when I wasn't able to expect it. I had been aware of the criteria, um, but was so caught up with the task itself that I hadn't given particularly fretted over hitting every key point. So it was part of the process that we had constant formative feedback at every step of the process, so the high chances of success were facilitated as they could be. So, by getting us to focus with the competent parts of the assessment throughout, we automatically had the clearest understanding of what we're trying to achieve. Had the criteria been given to us as one multiple page document, and I'm not sure if our focus each time would have been so tight. So, I felt I learned a lot from the experience about the content and how to chunk parts of the task for success. So I think that would end my discussion. Thank you so much for listening. And here are my references in APA style. Thank you, Doc.